Great. So why don't you go ahead and tell me a little bit about your background and briefly introduce yourself. If you want to talk about any current projects you're working on that are related to Turkmenistan, feel free.
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks, Marilyn. Obviously, thanks to Crude Accountability for everything, not only the event last week, but obviously all the work that you and your colleagues do. I mean, obviously, specifically on this on Turkmenistan. Hopefully, you were there to see me. I guess maybe earlier in the talk last week, really singing the praises of this report, filling this massive hole, this massive gap that had previously existed in our understanding of certainly Turkmen, but also Central Asian and even post-Soviet kind of transnational corruption and kleptocracy. I mean, my relevant background, as you and I were just discussing, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in northern Kazakhstan near the Kazakh-Russian border. That was my exposure to the post-Soviet world, and certainly to Central Asia. To say nothing of the kind of governance structures, obviously Kazakhstan having been, well, at the time it was only 20 years into the Nazarbayev regime, and obviously that extended to whatever it was, 29 or 30 years before he finally removed himself from the presidency, even though he obviously still has plenty of powers. And we actually left Peace Corps. When I was there, the Peace Corps was supposed to be about 2 years. We were only there for about 9 months. There were some security concerns and some governmental pressure to get the American Peace Corps volunteers to leave the country. And I mean, the timing goes into a whole bunch of different things, but most pertinently for our talk for Crude Accountability, we left about 1 month before the massacre, the shootings at Zhanaozen in western Kazakhstan, which you may or may not remember. These are striking oil workers that the government cracked down on in December of 2011. And I mean, I can't believe we're already coming up on the 10-year anniversary of it. So my background in certainly in Kazakhstan, I went to Rice University, which is down in Houston, Texas, which is obviously the big energy hub of the U.S. As well. When I came back, I actually began working as a reporter in Houston as well. And I actually ended up doing a little bit of investigative work, less on what the Kazakh government was doing and more on what the Azeri government was doing, the government in Azerbaijan, which is obviously a Caspian oil producing country itself, just a horribly corrupt government. And I got to begin investigating, reporting on how they were accessing Western policymakers. And I guess maybe the most important story from that era is that I was asked, they had some Azerbaijani lobbyists who were working in Houston that were organizing a congressional delegation to fly over to Baku, over to the capital of Azerbaijan, for this like incredibly lavish congressional junket. I mean, it was fine food, incredibly nice hotels, fireworks, whining and dining all of these American legislators. And I remember the lobbyist at the time, she asked me, would you like to come with? Would you like to come with these members of Congress? And these are members of the U.S. House of Representatives. We'd love to fly you over. We'll cover the cost of the ticket. We'll put you up in the hotel, and you can cover it for your newspaper. I said, that's a great offer. Let me talk to my editor about it. And she goes, well, yeah, you can do that. Just remember, when you come over, just, we don't want you to write anything negative about us. Because some people just want to come over and write about the corruption and everything else. And I said, well, I can't really make that promise, and I wouldn't want to anyways. And anyways, I relayed that to my editor. She said, yeah, maybe it's best we don't go. And I said, that's probably okay, because it turns out that junket was secretly funded. This was a congressional investigation later, a couple years later, secretly funded by the Azerbaijani main oil and gas company, SOCAR. So I'm glad I didn't secretly take any funds from them. Anyways, this is just a whole long, convoluted backstory. I went to graduate school for Russian and post-Soviet studies, ended up getting more and more interested in and involved in writing on and investigating transnational corruption, kind of what we now understand to be kleptocracy, how these regimes and these family members, these oligarchs, how they access Western financial systems, how they access what we call Western enablers, those who are enabling the access to these Western financial systems, Western jurisdictions. These are the lawyers, the lobbyists, the shell company providers, bankers, financial institutes, how that money moves, how it's hidden, and then how it's spent. And my main project these days, I've obviously continued writing on it for a number of publications here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere. My main project this day is it's a book called American Kleptocracy, how the U.S. created the world's greatest money laundering scheme in history. And it's exactly that. It's how the U.S. has transformed into this financial secrecy haven that has provided the tools for regimes oligarchs, elite members of these kleptocratic dictatorships, especially in the post-Soviet space, in places like Kazakhstan, in places like Uzbekistan, in places like, as we're talking today, Turkmenistan as well as Russia, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere, to move their money, hide their money, launder their money, and then what it means for the rest of us, kind of in these Western jurisdictions, in these Western polities. Because it's one thing to say that it's happening, but in order to actually affect the change, you need to understand why it's important to affect that change, because it also affects everything from national security to wealth inequality to, as we've seen in the US in the last 6, 7, 8 months, electoral legitimacy and everything that flows with it. So that's my long, rambly background about why I'm interested in and focused on and writing on this wonderful world of Central Asian kleptocracy.
Great. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
In your opinion, why have international organizations been letting Turkmenistan off the hook when it comes to corruption? And how can we make sure that we actually enforce the anti-corruption policies that are in place?
So what was the first one? Why are international organizations? What do you mean by letting them off the hook? I mean, is this kind of what the report was talking about how they were able to access, places like Deutsche Bank and the other Western energy firms that are working with the Turkmen government, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Um, so I think on the one hand, there's a relatively simple answer. On the other hand, there's a relatively complicated answer. I'll take the simple answer first, and that's because Western jurisdictions, Western companies, Western financial services industries have spent years, and at this point, decades, doing exactly that, not just for the Turkmen government, but for governments similar to the Turkmen regime all around the world. Whether it's the Angolan government under Dos Santos, whether it's certainly the Kazakh government under the Nazarbayev regime, whether it's what the Azerbaijani government was doing, whether it's what we've seen take place in places like horribly corrupt places like Egypt or Equatorial Guinea. This is a story that is now incredibly familiar of how these and why these Western companies, Western jurisdictions, Western financial services industries are more than willing to work with and improve themselves, more than willing to work with some of just the most heinous regimes and figures in the entire world. So in that sense, and this is one of the things that I talked about in the discussion that we had last week, there's almost, in a certain sense, nothing unique or nothing atypical about what the Turkmen government, the Berdi Muhamedov regime, his family members, his cronies were doing and were able to do. There's almost, in a certain sense, nothing unique about that. It is a story we have seen play out time and again. I mean, I think maybe what is unique is that, maybe North Korea aside, it's hard to find a government as repressive, as outright, unabashedly dictatorial and brutal as the Turkmen government. Which I think illustrates the fact that if these companies and these services and these Western jurisdictions are willing to work with the Turkmen government, there's nobody that they're not going to work with. And I think that is kind of proof of this concept. There's this kind of theory in regulatory circles, and we can talk about policy solutions later. But I mean, from the industry side, they don't want more regulations. They certainly don't want more governmental oversight. Their common refrain argument is that we can police ourselves, we can regulate ourselves, we will make sure that all of the preventative mechanisms and mechanisms that can prevent transnational corruption can be done internally. We can take this upon ourselves to make sure these systems are cleaned up and we're not working with nefarious actors. I mean, if they are willing to work as closely and for as long as they have with the Turkmen government, with the Turkmen regime, I mean, that is simply proof that any kind of self-regulatory mechanism is a non-starter, and that increased regulatory oversight, increased governmental oversight, and certainly increased penalties, with potential jail time on top of that for certain executives and for certain Western professional classes is an absolute must in terms of potential policy solutions to cleaning up these sectors and to preventing the Turkmen regime from exploiting and taking advantage of these services moving forward. So I guess that wasn't actually a simple answer. That probably combined the simple and complicated answer. I mean, again, I guess the complicated stuff is more in the weeds about exactly how they are using specific financial institutions and shell companies and moving their money and hiding their money. We can talk about that later, but yes, I've rambled for long enough
now. No, that was great. So during the session, it was mentioned that the sort of policies used by the US and Europe to combat corruption abroad typically target middlemen. Do you agree with this assessment? And if yes, how might we alter legislation to target the true source of kleptocracy in Turkmenistan?
Yeah, so I think the thing to keep in mind about kleptocracy when we discuss this phenomenon that we've kind of, begun categorizing and defining as kleptocracy. I mean, you can certainly say that the Turkmen government runs a kleptocratic regime. You can certainly say that the Kazakhs do. You can certainly say that the Tajik government does. You can certainly say any number of other regimes in the region run or oversee or have implemented and entrenched kleptocratic governments. But kleptocracy itself is not something that happens domestically. It is not something that happens within the confines of a single country, of a single jurisdiction, or even of a single regime in and of itself. It is something that requires multiple parties, multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, multiple financial systems, that it happens cross jurisdictionally, that it happens transnationally. I mean, the phrase is kleptocracy takes two to tango, and that's absolutely right. What we've come to understand of modern kleptocracy is exactly what the paper from Crude Accountability from Tom Main, the excellent paper highlighted, is that the Turkmen regime are entering into and taking advantage of these transnational, international, cross-border financial flows that we have seen other regimes in Baku or in Nur Sultan or in Dushanbe or Moscow, for that matter, take full advantage of as well. So that's the kind of primer about kleptocracy. It happens multi-jurisdictionally. It happens transnationally. When it comes to policy solutions, there's only so much that Western jurisdictions, that Washington or Brussels or whomever can do to pressure the Turkmen government to clean up its act internally or domestically. There are certainly levers. You think of sanctions packages, or you think of, even just basic statements of concerns. There are pressure-based elements that they can do. But that's not in a certain sense, that's the low-hanging fruit. It's easy enough to issue a statement. But if you want to have an actual effect, the greatest effect that the US or the EU or other Western jurisdictions can have is not on targeting those oligarchic members. It's not on targeting the regimes themselves. That can have effect, but the greatest effect that the US, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Swiss, the Australians, these destination countries for these sources of illicit wealth can have is, as we say, cleaning up our own backyard, implementing pro-transparency, anti-anonymity, and counter-kleptocracy. That's a lot of different terms, so sorry to whoever's transcribing that. Policies that bring light to or shed light on the industries that are taking full advantage of these dirty money outflows from the post-Soviet space, laundering it, hiding it, and then returning it so that these truly horrific figures can use it however they want. So these are financial services industries. These are what we called earlier the enablers. So these are professional classes, white collar service providers in the West. These are those who are setting up the shell companies. These are those who are setting up the anonymous trusts. These are those who are setting up or benefiting from the sales of anonymous real estate or anonymous private equity investments or anonymous hedge fund investments, or those who are working at auction houses that can give the material, the precious antiques, the collectibles, artwork to whoever they want, perfectly anonymously, for millions of dollars in return. These are especially the lawyers that are making sure that all of these financial flows are still perfectly legal, but are still perfectly anonymous. These are the kinds of professionals that are the key figures in allowing folks like Berdy Muhamedov, folks like his nephew, folks like his family members to access Western financial systems, to hide their money, to launder their money. As we saw in the report, that means things like being able to purchase, what was it? It was the Turkmen ambassador purchased, multiple $1 million homes here in the U.S., purchased huge swaths of, timberland. I don't know what he's going to do with it. It's certainly timber prices have been very high recently, so that's a nice added bonus for him right there. These are things like the bankers. Obviously the report goes to great lengths to highlight the role that Deutsche Bank in Germany, which is just a wickedly corrupt organization, a bank in and of itself that has worked with, the Gaddafi regime. It worked with the Sudanese under Bashir. It worked with Assad's government. It worked with any number of other horrific regimes. It's no surprise that when the Turkmen government needed a bank to look the other way for all their money to flow through, they went to Deutsche Bank. I mean, that's the one that's serviced Trump for however many years it was as well, which again is no surprise. But much of that, so Deutsche Bank is doing that. Okay, fine. But where were the German regulators? Where was the German financial regulatory apparatus and oversight? And then beyond that, why hasn't more been done to crack down on these kinds of European banks that are pursuing similar mechanisms elsewhere in other jurisdictions, in France or in Sweden or in Hungary or in Bulgaria, for that matter. I don't know if you saw, Meryl, there was the U.S. issued just last week, huge. I think it might have been the biggest ever single sanctions package against a bunch of Bulgarians for, I mean, again, similar topics, transnational corruption and all those who benefit from it. But anyways, yes, long convoluted way of saying the U.S., the West has to focus on cleaning up its own backyard, making sure to end these kind of empires of anonymity that are the key tools in what we now understand as kleptocracy, which obviously the Turkmen regime has taken full advantage of.
Mhm. So you touched on real estate as a vehicle for money laundering and as a possible option for cleaning up our backyard. So what is your opinion on Biden's recent statement about ending anonymous real estate purchases? And do you think a policy like that is realistic, and would it have the kind of impact that we need?
Sorry, wait, whose statement was it?
Biden?
Oh, Biden. Yes, I am 100% in support of his statement as it pertains to cleaning up the real estate sector, specifically as it pertains to barring the kinds of anonymous real estate purchases we have seen flourish. I mean, every single transnational kleptocratic network, whether it's out of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, you name it, odds are it's going to involve real estate one way or the other for the same reasons that any of us invest in or purchase real estate. It's a wonderfully stable industry. It's a hard asset that is likely not going to depreciate. And if you do need to sell it, the market is still going to be there. You can likely find another buyer, especially another potentially kleptocratic buyer in and of itself. And the key, again, to that is anonymity. For years and years and years in the US and Canada and much of Europe and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, you name it, across certainly the developed world, purchasing anonymous real estate was stupidly easy. All you had to do was take 15 minutes to set up a shell company, an anonymous shell company, attach a bank account to it, and have the financial flows go through there. You could even have additional layers of secrecy on top of that if you had a lawyer involved, and they could implement things like attorney-client privilege for that. And because of the ease of these mechanisms, the real estate industry in the US, but also elsewhere, has blossomed into, I would argue, the key pro-kleptocracy industry over the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, this is an industry that has exploded as a destination for dirty money flowing in from around the world. And that's not just the mega mansions of the world, right? We're not just talking about places in Malibu or Miami or Manhattan. We're now talking also about commercial real estate. We're talking about steel mills. We're talking about manufacturing plants. We're talking, obviously, as the Turkmen ambassador's case, timberland, sprawling acreage. I mean, anything for years and years was wide open to the kind of dirty money operators that we've seen attached to regimes like those in Turkmenistan. Again, it's no surprise that the Turkmen ambassador was linked to these multi-million-dollar property purchases. And the key, again, is ending anonymity. You have to end the ability of anonymous shell companies to purchase this. You have to end the ability of lawyers being freely able to set up these real estate purchases on behalf of anonymous clients. You have to create some kind of registry of ownership of who owns what, and what is their identifying information. That is to say, what is their name? How do they go about purchasing it? Or if it is a shell company that purchased it, who is controlling the shell company itself? I cannot. I mean, this is a spoiler for the book. The main policy proposal that I push is ending. Now that we've begun ending anonymity in shell companies in the U.S. and elsewhere, real estate is absolutely the next domino to fall. I mean, in the U.S. itself, in 98% of the country, you can still purchase anonymous real estate, and we are only just beginning to learn what kind of damage and devastation that has meant for local communities, for the real estate industry itself, and certainly for obviously those who have to live under the regimes in places like Ashgabat.
Yeah, it's truly unbelievable that that is still a policy.
It's
Do you think that it will be difficult to enforce?
That's a great question. And this is something I've said in other conversations. You can have as many regulations as you want on the books. You can have as many laws as you want on the books. But those laws and those regulations are not worth the paper that they are written on. I mean, this is perfectly applicable to the oil and gas industry and environmental regulations therein. These laws and regulations are nothing. They are nothing without enforcement and without resources dedicated to that enforcement. And we have seen, 20 years ago, the U.S. passed the most sweeping anti-money laundering legislation it had ever seen, and arguably to this day still has ever seen. And that was it was within the Patriot Act, which obviously has its own issues, but it was specifically dedicated to cleaning up the American banking sector. And it required banks to no longer work with those who were clearly corrupt abroad, no longer set up these kind of shell bank accounts, no longer accept money from whoever, however, for whatever amount they wanted, and also to set up these internal anti-money laundering mechanisms as well. And what we saw last year, there's a leak of a wide tranche of documents. These policies, they were successful insofar as they changed the narrative, they changed the dynamics of dirty money using specifically American banks as their primary go-to. But as we saw with this leak of large tranche of documents called the FinCEN files, is that we still had, millions and millions, in some cases billions of dollars in suspect money flowing through American banks. Yeah, it might be less than it once was, but because of the lack of resources, because of the lack of enforcement at the governmental level, it was still not nearly as effective a regulation and regulatory oversight as it could have been and as it should have been. And I think that is as clear a lesson as any as we push these pro-transparency, anti-kleptocracy policies further, about just how key and how important funding for, resourcing for, and then staffing up of these kinds of governmental oversight bodies is going to be. Because again, it doesn't matter. I mean, this is not specific to corruption or transnational corruption. You can have any law that you want. If it's not enforced, it's not going to be followed. And that is certainly an issue within these within the anti-corruption community. And as we begin proposing and pushing more and more regulatory oversight, you have to have the funding, you have to have the resourcing that comes with it. And again, this is also maybe a spoiler. Thankfully, we're starting to see that in the last 6 months with the new administration in Washington. There could always be more, but at least we're finally beginning to move in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great. It's good news, hopefully.
I mean, look, Mary, I don't have to explain that to you. You see the same dynamic in the, in the Arctic or in Antarctica, wherever, right? As it pertains to any kind of environmental regulation, it's not going to be enforced, then who's going to follow it?
Exactly. Why do you think we have seen so few Central Asians being targeted by the Department of Justice through bills like the Global Magnitsky Act?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in many ways, that's $1 million question because God knows there are so many wonderful candidates to be sanctioned under Global Magnitsky. I mean, I have my theories as it pertains to why we've seen that lack of action. I mean, certainly there's plenty of other wonderful candidates all around the world. And it's not like Global Magnitsky hasn't been used. I mean, it's a relatively new program, only, 5 years old now. I don't think the Central Asian figures were at the top of anybody's list as it pertains to the very first figures who should be targeted. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the next few years we do begin seeing more and more Central Asian figures targeted for Global Magnitsky. I mean, the most cynical response to that is that the U.S. simply wants to remain on good relations with governments in Turkmenistan, governments in Kazakhstan, governments in Uzbekistan, I mean, the rest of the region for purely geopolitical, purely realist concerns. And, we don't have to go into all the details of that, but I could certainly see why that would be the case. I would prefer to give a little bit more, of a gracious response and say they're going to get to them at some point. They just have a kind of bigger fish to fry right now. But there are certainly some absolutely fantastic candidates for listing under Global Magnitsky. Certainly, all of the figures that feature prominently in the Crude Accountability Report on Turkmenistan, whether it's members of Berdy Muhamedov's families, whether it's former officials from the Niyazov era that have now continued on. I mean, it's going to be kind of like shooting fish in a barrel when the American authorities do finally turn to the region. I mean, if the American authorities really want to make a splash, if they really want to specifically target the biggest factors in and elements of why the broader region, why Central Asia itself has become such kind of this bubbling stew of elite level corruption, and again what we now know as kleptocracy. Yeah, they can go after some of the oligarchs, and sure they can go after some of the family members, but if they really want to make a splash, they go after Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former president of Kazakhstan, who in so many different ways really created the playbook for what we now understand and now recognize as these kleptocratic dictatorships. And beyond that, it's not just the repression, it's not just the brutality, it's not just the lack of free and fair elections, and certainly in the oil and gas sector, it's not just the cronyism and the environmental damage that comes with it, but it's also how Nazarbayev accessed Western financial flows, Western actors, Western enablers, to then move his money, launder his money using things like Swiss bank accounts, but also to then try to pressure Western governments to lift investigations into his into his finances. You think of 2019, 2020, what certain Ukrainian figures, Ukrainian oligarchs were trying to do with President Trump to get him to lift investigations in return for so-called dirt on Joe Biden. We saw that they were almost successful in that. I mean, that was a playbook that unfortunately they did not invent. This is what Nazarbayev was doing back in the mid 2000s with the Bush administration, going to them directly and saying, you need to lift these investigations into me and my family. And thankfully, or surprisingly, or whatever term you like to use, at the time, the Bush administration said, we can't do that. The DOJ is an independent entity. You have Nazarbayev hiring folks like Tony Blair to try to create this image of Nazarbayev in the West as this great statesman, as this this benevolent figure, when in reality, he is the one that is overseeing a decades-long dictatorship in Kazakhstan. Anyways, that's kind of a little tangent about who I think should be at the DOJ's top of list for Global Magnitsky. But if the U.S. really does want to have an effect in the region and prove that the Global Magnitsky program can be as effective as it should be, that's who they need to go after, because that is going to send shivers down the spines of every other high-ranking member of every other regime, and frankly, every other president that has any kind of autocratic bent in the region itself.
Yeah, that sounds like a great recommendation. If you can make one policy recommendation to the US government related to American financial institutions and their involvement in corruption, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this basket of reforms that I mean, we talked about last week. You talk to anybody in this space, they'll kind of repeat the same few things. I mean, at the highest level, it's ending anonymity in the industries that have proven themselves to be the greatest friends of the kleptocrats around the world, kleptocratic regimes, oligarchs, cronies, et cetera, to move, hide, and launder those ill-gotten gains and all that, trillions of dollars in dirty money. So anyways, just a basic rundown. It's ending anonymity in shell companies, ending anonymity in trusts, ending anonymity in real estate, ending anonymity in private equity and hedge funds, ending anonymity in the art market. There's two more. Ending anonymity in auctions, and now I'm completely blanking on the last one. Ending anonymity in luxury goods purchases. I knew I could remember all of them. So these are things like yachts, private jets, high-end automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. If you could end anonymity in all of those sectors, you would go a massive way toward cleaning up what we now understand as kleptocracy. And then obviously beyond that, continuing to staff up, continuing to resource the regulations and the regulatory bodies that are already in existence that specifically monitor illicit financial flows through Western banks and financial institutions as well. There are other recommendations beyond that. That includes things like increased internal best practices for nonprofits, that is to say, universities, think tanks, cultural institutions that have been taking all this dirty money perfectly. I mean, these are private institutions; they can do it perfectly legally without publicizing any information about who their donors are or what their the protocols for accepting donations is. That again allows these kleptocratic figures to transform themselves into philanthropists and statesmen and good government. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about the Turkmen case study is that, to the best of our knowledge, or as far as we can tell, the Turkmen haven't actually tried to start doing that yet. That's not to say that they won't at some point, but it doesn't seem like they follow that path just yet of, donating $200 million or whatever to a university or to a think tank or to a cultural center to whitewash the regime itself. Increased regulatory requirements for especially lawyers as well would go a significant way to make sure that they are not involved in setting up the shell companies or the real estate purchases or the other related purchases for the specific benefit of laundering millions and millions of dollars of dirty money. I mean, again, there's a whole basket of proposed reforms, but ending anonymity, beyond all, is the key in the shell company, trust, real estate sectors, and then in a handful of the other sectors that I listed as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think Trump's report definitely tries to address some of that just by exposing a lot of the people involved in these schemes. So, well, I want to be mindful of your time. So is there anything that I did not touch on that you would like to bring up?
No, I mean, just to reinforce what I said in the talk that we had last week about how, and I don't want to sound like I'm brown nosing or anything. I mean, the report that came out from Crude Accountability from Tom Main last week was one of the kind of final dominoes, I think, to fall in our understanding of how Central Asian and more broadly post-Soviet corruption and kleptocracy operates. For years and years, Turkmenistan, for any number of reasons, both the Niyazov regime as well as the Berdi Muhamedov regime have been this really black hole of information. I mean, certainly to a large extent because they tried to make it a black hole without publishing financial information, without publishing personnel information, without publishing corporate information. For years, when those of us study the region, study kleptocracy in Central Asia and post-Soviet space, we focused on the Kazakhstans or the Azerbaijans or the Tajikistans or the Russias of the world or of the region. Nobody paid any attention to what was going on and then what was coming out of Turkmenistan. We had no idea whether or not they were as isolated and as autarkic financially in terms of elite predation and elite financial flows as the Berdi Muhamedov regime claimed they were. Now we know that's not the case at all. Now we know they are following the exact same financial flows, the exact same patterns that the other regimes in the region are following. And in a certain sense, that shouldn't be surprising at all because those other regimes have been able to do so successfully for so many years. And it only makes sense that the Turkmen regime would follow the same methods themselves of shell company movements, of real estate purchases, of turning to banks like Deutsche Bank. And I just want to commend everybody at Crude Accountability again for filling that much needed gap, and certainly long overdue gap, that we can now look to and say, no, it turns out that the Turkmen regime, well, it's just like all the other regimes that are following the similar kleptocratic patterns, and certainly accessing similar Western financial systems and Western industries as well. So thank you and your colleagues, Muriel, at Crude Accountability again. It was an absolutely wonderful report, and I'm sure one we'll be talking about for a while.